Welcome to Dungeon Brew. I am Josh, and this is my series on world building where I lead you through a collection of videos on how I build worlds for my ttrpg. So sit back, relax, and I will see you on the other side of the intro. Salutations, my fellow primates. We are back to discuss world building, and today we're going to be talking about how to create a pantheon for your tabletop RPG. This may seem to be a weird place to begin your world building process. Before you even created the physical world, kind of diving into the divine structures of the world itself. But I like taking this approach because it allows me to understand the cosmos and the orchestrators or clockmakers or creators of the cosmos before I actually begin to build the physical world. And part of the reason I like to start here is because honestly, it aligns with my own passions and my education. I have my PhD in philosophy. I wrote my dissertation on the evolution of religious belief among hominids. And so I just really like kind of diving into this because it's something I'm passionate about. And so I find myself inventing gods and giving them personalities before I'm even creating the town that my adventurers are going to be starting their adventure in. So before we dive into creating the Pantheon, I do want to talk about the type of world we're going to be creating so that we're all coming from the same place in terms of what this blueprint looks like. In my last video, I talked about a number of different abstract ideas to kind of give you some different starting points of what you might do before creating a world to define what that gaming world is. I want to let you know what I've decided on for the definition of this world that I'm going to be creating. So the first thing that we talked about last time was theme. The themes that I'm choosing for this world are going to be power and corruption as well as free will. So a lot of my story and the things that I'm incorporating into this world are going to be centralized around those themes. Then we talked about the tone or genre, and I'm going to have some fun with this in terms of the genre that I'm picking. We're going to be doing a low magic, diesel punk, noble, dark genre for fantasy. Now, if you're not familiar with diesel punk, my brother and I did a video on that, but we're looking at essentially this interwar period between like 1910, 1920 to about 1950, where there's retro futuristic technology and these noir elements. Then Noble Dark is going to be looking at having some characters that are flawed, that are facing some really grim realities, but they have this sense of hope within them that they're going to be able to overcome it. So I want to make sure that I'm instilling elements that kind of reinforce that genre and that tone. Then we're going to be looking at mood. And since I'm going to be trying to develop this emotional atmosphere to appeal to the characters and make them feel like they're in here, I might be looking at some postmodern sensibilities and explorations with some political ideas or even philosophical ideas related to this time period. In the 1920s and 1950s is where we saw a lot of introduction of like quantum mechanic theory coming out. And so I'm going to be touching on some theories and some understandings and interpretations of things specific to power, corruption, and free will that you might see coming from philosophers like Max Born or Heisenberg or Pascal Jordan or Schrodinger, so that I can really have my characters be considering the implications and the differences between like causality or determinism or indeterminism throughout the story. And this is going to be reflected in some of the deities that I am going to be creating for this pantheon that we're going to be looking at today. In regard to the core aesthetic, I'm going to have this be a 50% exploration, 30% combat, and 20% social campaign. I haven't decided what system I want to use yet, but I'm not too overly concerned about that right now, just in the world building process. I'll decide that later. And then lastly, I did just jot down some ideas for my 3-part act and what I'm considering, where the first act is understanding the intent of the gods, kind of getting the plot laid out for what they believe the gods are wanting from them as characters. The second one is understanding what free will is to them, and there's a lot of different options for how they may perceive free will based on the different theories that were kind of circulating during this time period. And then lastly, my third act would actually be confronting the gods. Just to cut myself off before I go on a tangent about story. It's something I do often, and I'm sure it drives my brother crazy. So I wanted to talk about the importance of understanding the evolution of religious thought among hominids as we understand it as Homo sapiens. So you can have some understanding of what our history looks like in hopes that that will help you determine what type of divine structure you want to build for your particular world. Now, you can have a lot of creative liberties with this. You don't have to follow what we've seen historically in our own world, but oftentimes that is the building blocks from which we pull inspiration from to make it realistic, to have better immersion for our players in the worlds that we build. So about 600,000 to 100,000 years ago, we have evidence of things like cannibalism, arranged rock formations, or even paintings on cave walls that are linked by paleontologists to have some connection to spirituality. Then about 100,000 years ago, in the Middle Paleolithic era, we see animism really emerging. Now, this is something that naturally developed in our biological evolution in order for us to survive as early hominids. This is something where we start putting agency into immaterial things in the world, whether that be a rustling in the leaves or the storms that are, forming overhead, or even volcanic mountains. We started determining that these things had their own agency, and that something was driving behind them, more like nature than the gods themselves. That would come later. But this was something that kind of continued to develop and move onwards into the Upper Paleolithic era, where we continue to see more art taking place. We started seeing the development of like ancestral worship and shamanism take place. But even in all of this, there was no higher god. There was no divine pantheon structure. This was really something that hunter and gatherers practiced amongst their little small tribes, or those that were moving around together. They gave them a sense of the world around them, a sense of purpose, so to speak, and allowed them to feel connected with nature and with the spiritual realms in some way, shape, or form. It wasn't until the Holocene era, about 12,500 years ago, that we started seeing the construction of centralized worship centers. Now, this had to do a lot with the agricultural changes that took place during the time, and individuals being able to abandon the hunter-gatherer lifestyle from being nomads and being able to settle down in one place where they could grow food and start growing larger settlements. And this is where we again see political and religious institutions start to arise to help govern these larger settlements of Homo sapiens, to be able to give some structure, some order to so many folks gathered in one place. And this is where we start to see things really piece together in terms of the divine realms and the principalities and all these things that would allow so many individuals to function within one centralized location. And then about 2,500 to 3,000 years ago, we see monotheism begin to become more popularized, and individuals leaning in that way, which isn't to say that individuals didn't worship singular gods prior to that time, but they kind of had this genuine respect of there being many gods in the pantheon. But monotheism has then gained more interest as things like war and genocide and slavery and technological advancements have helped it spread throughout civilization. So that's kind of like a rough breakdown of what we've seen in terms of the evolution of religious thought among hominids, human beings, in our own history. And hopefully that gives you some understanding of what type of system you may create for your divine order. Maybe you choose to have a dualistic system with a good god and a bad god on either side of the fence. Or maybe you have a singular god. It's a monotheistic belief system where there's one god that controls and oversees everything. Perhaps you choose to look at the pantheon that I'm going to provide to you in this video and only choose a few of those types of gods that you want to have in your pantheon. Or maybe you choose to have no gods at all. Maybe you see the universe as having a structure that are governed by physics and laws that allow it to function without any type of clockmaker or overseer that is puppeteering the system within. All of these, I think, are respectable ways to build your world. It's just deciding, what do you think makes the most sense for your world, and how does that fit based on what we know about religious thought? Okay, so now that you've heard me talk about all of this for probably 10 minutes, let's go ahead and dive into building a pantheon for your tabletop role-playing game. Okay, so the first thing I do when I'm trying to create a pantheon is I am looking at developing 12 gods that are going to be directly reflective of the 12 Jungian archetypes. Those are the archetypes that were created by psychoanalyst Carl Jung. And the reason I do that is for three reasons, really. One, You can look around all mythologies around the world from different cultures and take the top 12 gods in those mythologies and find that they very much align with these 12 archetypes. Number two, anytime that you do some research into the characteristics of each one of these archetypes, they appear to be projections of the different types of things that humans possess in our own personalities, in the way that we engage with one another. And three, it allows for great storytelling. Even when you look at many of the stories that are told or the myths that are kind of shared around the world, all of them possess some aspect of these archetypes with lessons to be learned. So it sets you up really well to create myths and story related to the gods in the world building process. So what I am going to do is look at each one of these archetypes, talk about them a little bit, and let you know which Greek god specifically aligns with each one of them, so that you might be able to use that as an example in the creation of your own god. So the first archetype that you are going to want to fill is what is called the innocent. Demeter is who fills this position in the Greek pantheon. And this archetype is a deity that is benevolent. They are kind, they're full of purity, they have hope. It's somebody that has some untarnished beginnings. They have a childlike wonder and an unspoiled potential about them. This is something that's very reflective of Demeter in her relationship with Persephone, her daughter, throughout Greek stories. The second archetype that we're looking at is the orphan, also sometimes called the artist or the innovator, and it's oftentimes related to metallurgy gods who started off as the underdogs in many religious beliefs around the world that eventually rose up to some sort of power and influence over others. In Greek mythology, this is Hephaestus. If you're looking at Egypt, it'd be Ptah, or in early Abrahamic religions, it would be Yahweh or Adonai. It's a god that is the underdog that's cast aside, and it ends up being the god of the people who helps them deal with abandonment and work towards self-discovery. It's the god of resilience, the god that helps others overcome adversity. The third archetype is the warrior, sometimes called the hero, and of course in Greek mythology this is Ares, the god of war. It epitomizes courage and determinism and discipline. It's about seeing justice done by whatever means necessary. It's about being triumphant over tyranny. But with this particular archetype, it also has this lingering sense of danger, in the sense that it will go to whatever extreme to see something done. You want to make sure that this god is a bit intense. The fourth archetype is looking at the caregiver, and in Greek mythology this is Hera. If you were looking to Egyptian, it might be Isis, or if you're looking to Norse, it might be Frigga. This, of course, is the nurturing, protective caregiver that you see in many mythologies, oftentimes being the spouse of one of the higher gods in the pantheon. They embody selfless compassion, they're empathetic, they have that healing touch, and are very much worshipped by those that value family and connectiveness. The fifth archetype is the seeker, sometimes called the explorer. And in Greek pantheon, this is Artemis. If you're looking at Rome, it would be goddess Diana, or within Hindu, it would be Saraswati. This is the deity that is really pushing mortals towards self-discovery. It's about trying to help them transform into something greater than themselves. It's all about having this eternal quest towards knowledge and enlightenment. The sixth archetype is the lover, and of course in Greek mythology this is Aphrodite. If we were looking at Mesopotamian deities, this would be Inanna. If you were looking at Phoenician deities, this would be Astarte. The lover is one that really embodies passion and sexuality and fervor, very intense in wanting to express this transformative power of love. And they're looking for deep connections. They're good at making long-lasting connections because of their romantic devotion and the emotional fulfillment that they provide. And that's what this is going to represent in your pantheon. Seventh archetype is the destroyer, sometimes called the everyman, which I always find interesting because it reflects the very destructive nature of the human being. In Greek mythology, this is Poseidon. If you were to look at Slavic myth, it would be Morskoi, or even in Babylonian myth, it'd be Enki. It has to do with this cycle of destruction and creation that comes through the cycles of life. It's about perpetual renewal and evolution and change and molding that I think is very reflective by Poseidon. If you look at the 8th archetype, then we're going to be talking about the creator. Now, in Greek mythology, this would actually probably be Phanes, that is one of the older gods outside of the Pantheon, but you can also apply this towards Apollo, which has the same connotation of light that was represented in each one of these, but it is an artistic God that is able to have like this boundless potential for shaping things and creating things, having a divine craftsmanship, if you will. They mold the essence of things into existence. And of course, Apollo became a little bit more popularized as you got into times of antiquity that very much represented those types of things. And then separate from that would be our 9th archetype, which is the ruler. And this, of course, is Zeus that we see here, this authoritative force that's within the Pantheon that provides this wisdom and this justice and this regal presence that establishes like the order and the balance of how things go overall. In Old Slavic myth, this would be Svarog. The 10th archetype is the magician, and in Greek mythology, this is Dionysus. And like gods previous to him that also had the same archetype, like Horus or Osiris, Dionysus was able to perform miracles like turning water into wine or being raised from the dead several days after he had died. He was known as the god of wine and celebration and festivity, and he had the knowledge of secret things, the gnosis, and he was a master of the arcane and understanding the mysteries of the world and how to transform oneself to become aware of those so that they could shape the very fabric of reality to essentially align with themselves as they actualized. The 11th archetype is the sage, and in Greek mythology, this is Athena. Unlike the magician, the sage is one that is pursuing intellect and wisdom from a more formal means, whether that's the pursuit of philosophy or mathematics or logic. They're one who is, again, embodying wisdom and insight and the pursuit of enlightenment, but it may be through more of an understanding of the natural elements of things. And then we have our final archetype, number 12, which is the fool, oftentimes called the jester. I like to call it the trickster, which is represented from gods, like Loki out of Norse myth. But in Greek mythology, this is Hermes, and it's this whimsical deity that injects joy and spontaneity into the pantheon. They like to play tricks on individuals. They like to celebrate just life and its experiences. They're unpredictable, and there's a lot of laughter and play that goes along with them. And as you've noticed, as I've talked about these 12 different archetypes, you can probably imagine how these have begun to blend or bleed into each other, how some of them start to carry other characteristics of other ones. Sometimes it's hard to draw the line where one archetype begins and where another one ends. And this has very much been a result of the smashing together of cultures throughout human history, where they start to kind of take on certain aspects as people get confused or tell their stories differently or begin to worship one deity over another, maybe due to an enemy invasion into their territory or a forceful indoctrination of a particular belief system. So sometimes it's hard to draw these lines exactly where one archetype begins and another ends, but hopefully this gives you some groundwork to start building your own pantheon. I just want to end with a few things to consider as you're building this pantheon as you are moving into the rest of your world building process. At this step, I have to distinguish in my mind the difference between what I know as the world builder and what the inhabitants of my world, or even the players that are going to be experiencing my world, know about the deities. We will eventually be getting into building cultures, and of course religion is going to have a huge part to play in that, but the customs and the celebrations and the religious practices that exist within my villages and my hamlets and my cities may differ from what the truth is that I know as the world builder about this pantheon that I've created. Now, as we move through this series and we bring the pantheon back into the picture for some different aspects, I'm going to be referring to the deities in regards to the particular archetype that they're referred to. If I was building a real campaign, I would give them names and they would be representative of that. But to not cause too much confusion. Like we'll call the seeker, and the caregiver, and the orphan. But we will want to determine what role do any of these deities have in the happenings of the mortals or the races that I create across my world, and how do I want to have each one of them play a part in doing that. These are things that I'm going to be thinking about as I continue to go through the world building process. And for yourselves, you may be thinking about, hey, does the hero come down and visit mortals? Does the caretaker stay far removed? Does the jester enjoy going down and playing tricks on the different inhabitants of the world, or even on the gods themselves? And for me, in regards to how I'm looking at this particular story coming out, it's going to be a lot to do with what is free will, and how does that impact the inhabitants of this world? Do they have a choice to act against the will of the gods, or are they forced to fall within line with what is being asked of them? So all these things are going to be generating through my mind. But the big piece that I want to say here is that as the world builder, you have to make sure that you put a distinguishment between what the cultures do in the world and what you know as the world builder in regard to the pantheon that you are developing. So I hope that this has been helpful in you beginning your journey in creating a system of gods and goddesses and deities overall. If you've enjoyed this video, please hit the like and subscribe button, hit that little bell so you know when the next one comes out. And if you don't see me next, I hope that you're at least watching John's videos. He's doing some great stuff over there and talking about his world building process. I'll see you all next time.
Welcome to Dungeon